September 11, 2001. The Pentagon, Arlington, Virginia, at 9:37 a.m. Eastern Time. American Airlines Flight 77, a Boeing 757 carrying 58 passengers, 4 flight attendants, 2 pilots, and 5 al-Qaeda hijackers who had seized control of the aircraft 35 minutes after takeoff from Dulles International Airport, slammed into the western face of the Pentagon between corridors 4 and 5 at approximately 530 miles per hour, penetrating the building's recently renovated wedge, where reinforced steel and Kevlar blast-resistant materials had been installed as part of billion-dollar upgrade program, ironically designed to protect against terrorist attacks. The impact creating fireball that consumed offices of Army Personnel Command and killing 125 Pentagon workers, including Lieutenant General Timothy Maud, the highest-ranking military officer to die that day, while creating massive structural damage that would have been far worse had the renovation not included strengthened walls and sprinkler systems that helped contain the fire and prevent total collapse of the damaged section. Inside the building's E-ring offices, where senior Army leadership maintained their command suites, General Jack Keane, Vice Chief of Staff of the Army and second-ranking officer in the service, felt the massive structure shudder as if struck by earthquake, followed immediately by the distinctive smell of jet fuel and burning materials that told experienced military officer trained to recognize battlefield conditions that this was not bomb or gas explosion but aircraft impact. Realization that arrived simultaneously with understanding that America was experiencing coordinated attack of unprecedented scale, and that the military headquarters itself had become target in war that most generals had not imagined possible on American soil. The context that made the Pentagon attack so psychologically devastating to American military leadership was that the building represented not just administrative headquarters, but symbolic heart of American military power. Fortress designed to withstand conventional assault and equipped with redundant communication systems and hardened command centers that were supposed to enable military operations even during nuclear war. The fact that commercial airliner hijacked by 19 terrorists armed with box cutters could penetrate Pentagon's defenses and kill over 100 military personnel in their offices demonstrated vulnerability that shattered assumptions about homeland security and about the nature of modern warfare. For generals who had spent careers preparing for conflicts against nation-state adversaries with conventional military forces, the idea that non-state actors using civilian aircraft as weapons could strike at the very center of American military command represented paradigm shift requiring fundamental rethinking of threat assessment and defense priorities. General Keane was 58 years old and had served in Army for 37 years, including combat tour in Vietnam and command positions throughout Cold War era, when primary threat was Soviet military power that could be deterred through nuclear weapons and that could be engaged through conventional forces if deterrence failed. His office on the outer E-ring placed him relatively far from impact point, but close enough that the explosion's shockwave and the immediate smoke infiltrating the building's ventilation system made clear that Pentagon had been hit hard. His first instinct, shaped by decades of military training emphasizing command responsibility and situational awareness, was to understand what had happened and to ensure that Army's senior leadership could maintain command and control even if building was under sustained attack. The immediate minutes after impact were characterized by confusion about whether additional attacks were imminent, about whether evacuation was necessary or whether staying in place was safer, and about how to maintain communications with field commands and with National Military Command Center located in Pentagon's basement where defense operations were coordinated. Keane later described the scene in corridors as controlled chaos, with military personnel instinctively moving toward emergency exits while senior officers attempted to account for their staffs and to establish what damage had been done. The smell of jet fuel was overpowering, and smoke was beginning to fill hallways despite ventilation systems designed to filter out contaminants, creating conditions that reminded Keane of combat environments he had experienced in Vietnam, but that seemed surreal within Pentagon's normally sterile office environment. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, 69 years old and serving in his second stint as Defense Secretary after previously holding position under President Ford from 1975 to 1977, was in his office on Pentagon's E-Ring when Flight 77 struck. Rumsfeld's reaction was characteristic of his hands-on management style and his conviction that leaders should personally engage with crises rather than managing from remote command centers. According to multiple eyewitness accounts, Rumsfeld left his office within minutes of impact and went outside to crash site in Pentagon's west parking lot, where burning wreckage and injured personnel were being evacuated from building. Photographs and testimony from Pentagon staff show Rumsfeld helping to carry stretcher with injured victim, physically participating in rescue efforts, while his security detail attempted to convince him to return to secure command center. The decision to personally engage in rescue work while serving as Secretary of Defense during attack on United States has been subject to extensive debate and criticism. Supporters argue that Rumsfeld's actions demonstrated leadership and personal courage, that his presence at crash site boosted morale of rescue workers and demonstrated that senior officials would not hide in bunkers while others faced danger. Critics argue that Rumsfeld's proper place during national emergency was in National Military Command Center directing military response to attacks, that his participation in rescue efforts removed him from chain of command at critical moment when decisions about protecting American airspace and responding to ongoing attacks needed to be made by Defense Secretary, and that his actions reflected poor judgment about priorities and about proper role of civilian defense leadership during crisis. General Richard Myers, Vice Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff and second-ranking military officer in entire Department of Defense, was on Capitol Hill meeting with Senator Max Cleland when first reports came through about planes hitting World Trade Center. Myers later testified before 9/11 Commission that he was informed about Pentagon attack while still on Capitol Hill, and that he immediately returned to Pentagon, where he found building partially evacuated and senior leadership attempting to establish command and control from National Military Command Center. Myers' account describes atmosphere of urgent confusion as military officers attempted to understand scope of attacks, to account for personnel in damaged sections of building, and to coordinate with Federal Aviation Administration about potential additional hijacked aircraft that might be heading toward Washington or other targets. The specific words spoken by generals inside Pentagon immediately after attack have been preserved in various memoirs, commissioned testimonies, and interviews conducted in years following September 11th. General Keane recalled telling his staff, "We need to get accountability of everyone in this building, and we need to maintain command and control of Army operations regardless of what's happening here," reflecting military discipline and focus on maintaining organizational function, even during crisis. He described ordering subordinates to contact major Army commands worldwide to inform them that Pentagon had been attacked, but that Army leadership remained operational and that normal command procedures should continue unless specifically instructed otherwise. In National Military Command Center, the conversation among senior officers focused on immediate tactical questions about air defense and about protection of Washington airspace from potential additional attacks. According to declassified transcripts and testimony, military officers were demanding answers about why fighter aircraft had not intercepted hijacked planes before they reached targets, about what rules of engagement applied to shooting down civilian aircraft that might be under terrorist control, and about whether presidential authorization was required to destroy commercial airliner if it was heading toward populated area or government building. The questions revealed how unprepared military command structure was for scenario where threat came from civilian aircraft rather than from foreign military forces, and how existing protocols and authorization procedures were inadequate for responding to fast-moving terrorist attacks using unconventional weapons. General Myers later described the frustration of trying to coordinate military response, while standard communication procedures were disrupted by Pentagon damage and by confusion about what authority had been delegated to military commanders to take defensive actions without explicit presidential approval. The shoot-down order that Vice President Dick Cheney issued from Presidential Emergency Operations Center beneath White House, authorizing military to destroy any aircraft that appeared threatening, did not reach fighter pilots in time to affect outcomes on September 11th, but it raised profound questions about rules of engagement and about whether American military should be authorized to shoot down civilian aircraft carrying American citizens if those aircraft were being used as weapons. Lieutenant General Timothy Maude, Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel and highest-ranking Army officer killed on September 11th, was in his office in the section of Pentagon that took direct hit from Flight 77. Maude, 56 years old and veteran of Vietnam War and Gulf War, was meeting with staff members when aircraft struck, killing him and several of his personnel instantly. The loss of three-star general in terrorist attack on Pentagon had symbolic significance beyond military impact, representing the fact that America's military leadership was vulnerable to attack in ways that previous generations of officers had never experienced. Maude's death personalized the attack for Army leadership and reinforced the message that United States was a new kind of war where distinction between military and civilian targets was irrelevant to adversaries who sought maximum casualties and maximum psychological impact. The evacuation of Pentagon, ordered within 15 minutes of impact, created scene of thousands of military and civilian personnel streaming out of buildings' various exits, while firefighters and rescue teams were simultaneously trying to enter damaged areas to search for survivors and to fight fires that threatened to spread beyond renovated Wedge where impact occurred. General Keane described watching from parking lot as smoke poured from Pentagon's western face and as emergency responders established triage areas for injured personnel. The surreal quality of watching Pentagon burn while knowing that attacks in New York had killed potentially thousands created atmosphere of shock combined with rage and determination to respond that would shape American military policy for next 2 decades. The conversation among generals in hours immediately following attack, as senior leadership regrouped in secure command centers and began planning military response to terrorism, revealed the psychological transition from peacetime defense establishment to wartime footing that would define post-9/11 military operations. According to participants in these discussions, the dominant themes were anger at intelligence failures that had allowed attacks to occur, determination to identify and destroy those responsible regardless of where they were located or what actions would be required, and recognition that American military would need to adapt to fighting enemies who did not wear uniforms and who did not operate according to conventional rules of warfare. General Hugh Shelton, chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, was aboard aircraft over Atlantic Ocean en route to Europe when attacks occurred and was unable to participate in immediate response coordination. His absence meant that Myers, as vice chairman, had to assume responsibility for military coordination, creating temporary confusion about command authority that was resolved when Shelton returned to United States later that day. Shelton later described his frustration at being unable to contribute during critical hours and his concern that military response mechanisms were not functioning as designed because senior leadership was scattered and because standard communication procedures were disrupted by Pentagon damage. The alternative scenarios that might have prevented Pentagon attack or that might have reduced casualties reveal both opportunities that were missed and limitations on what was possible given information available and given existing security procedures. If intelligence agencies had shared information more effectively about known al-Qaeda operatives who were in United States, if airport security had been more rigorous in screening passengers and in preventing box cutters from being carried onto aircraft, if fighter aircraft had been scrambled earlier after first hijackings were confirmed, the Pentagon attack might have been prevented. But these alternatives required changes to policies and procedures that seemed unnecessary before September 11th, and that would have required resources and attention that were focused on other priorities in pre-9/11 environment. If Pentagon's renovation program had not strengthened the western wedge with blast-resistant materials and sprinkler systems, casualties would likely have been far higher, and structural damage might have caused catastrophic collapse similar to what occurred at World Trade Center. The irony that renovation designed to protect against truck bombs happened to provide protection against aircraft impact was not lost on military leadership analyzing what had happened. If Flight 77 had struck different section of Pentagon that had not been renovated, or if it had hit building at different angle that might have caused more extensive structural failure, the death toll could have exceeded several hundred rather than the 125 who actually died. The psychological impact on American generals of having Pentagon attacked went beyond immediate tactical concerns about force protection and response coordination. The attack challenged fundamental assumptions about American invulnerability, about the effectiveness of deterrence against terrorist organizations that had no territory to defend and no conventional assets to destroy, and about whether military power designed for conflicts against nation-states could be effectively employed against networked terrorist organizations operating in multiple countries. The questions generals were asking in Pentagon corridors and command centers on September 11th were not just about immediate response, but about fundamental strategy for conducting war against adversaries who could not be defeated through conventional military operations. General Keane later reflected that the Pentagon attack marked the end of post-Cold War peace dividend era when military budgets were being reduced and when focus was shifting from preparing for major wars to peacekeeping and humanitarian operations. September 11th demonstrated that threats to American security had not disappeared with Soviet Union's collapse, and that new adversaries were emerging who could strike at United States despite overwhelming American conventional military superiority. The challenge for military leadership was adapting institutions and strategies designed for 20th century warfare to 21st century conflicts against non-state actors using asymmetric tactics. The long-term consequences of what generals said and decided inside Pentagon on September 11th shaped American military operations for next 2 decades, including wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, dramatic expansion of special operations forces and drone warfare capabilities, creation of new combatant commands focused on counterterrorism, and transformation of military training and doctrine to emphasize counterinsurgency and irregular warfare. The conversations in Pentagon command centers on September 11th focused initially on immediate crisis response, evolved within days into planning for military operations against al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and into broader strategic discussions about how to prevent future attacks through offensive operations against terrorist organizations worldwide. What American generals said inside Pentagon when it was attacked was that America was at war, that military would need to adapt to fighting enemies who used unconventional tactics and who could not be deterred through traditional means, that revenge for attacks would be swift and overwhelming, and that preventing future attacks would require fundamental changes to how military operated both domestically and internationally. They said that casualties among Pentagon personnel would be honored and that deaths of colleagues would motivate commitment to destroying those responsible. They said that building could be repaired, but that sense of invulnerability had been shattered, and that awareness of vulnerability would shape military planning going forward. But generals also struggled with questions they could not immediately answer about how to fight war against adversaries who had no capitals to capture and no armies to defeat, about whether traditional metrics of military success applied to counter-terrorism operations, about how much collateral damage was acceptable when targeting terrorists who deliberately hid among civilian populations, and about whether military solutions alone could address underlying conditions that motivated terrorism. These questions would remain unresolved throughout conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, leading to strategic failures and to recognition that military power, while necessary for combating terrorism, was not sufficient without political, economic, and ideological components that addressed root causes of extremism. What Pentagon attack revealed about American military preparedness was that defenses designed for Cold War threats were inadequate for terrorism, that coordination between military and civilian agencies was insufficient for responding to domestic attacks, that assumptions about homeland security were dangerously optimistic, and that institutional cultures and bureaucratic procedures needed dramatic reform to address new threats. The generals inside Pentagon on September 11th learned these lessons personally and immediately, watching their headquarters burn and mourning colleagues killed while sitting at desks in building that was supposed to be impregnable fortress of American military power.